It is the 26th of July, 1942, and the town of Przemyśl sits astride the river San in what was once southeastern Poland, now absorbed into the administrative machinery of the general government. On the eastern bank, in the district the Germans have designated a Jewish quarter, several thousand people wait behind fences, uncertain whether the morning will bring another day of forced labor or something worse. On the western bank, a Wehrmacht officer named Albert Battel gives an order that no one in his position is supposed to give. He directs soldiers under his command to occupy the bridge connecting the two halves of the town and to bar entry to the SS and police units who have arrived to begin a deportation. Machine guns are set up facing the approach. When an SS commander objects, he is told, in effect, to stand down, and it is the SS men who withdraw, not the army. This has never happened before in the German occupation of Poland, and it will happen only a handful of times again anywhere in occupied Europe. A serving officer of the Wehrmacht has used armed troops to physically stop an SS deportation action, and he has done it in daylight with witnesses, leaving a paper trail that his own superiors will read within days. This is a story about the machinery built to make such refusal nearly unthinkable, and about the narrow, dangerous space in which one man decided it was not unthinkable at all. By the summer of 1942, the deportation of Polish Jews to the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard, principally Bełżec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, had become a matter of grim routine across the general government. The system depended on a specific division of labor that made mass killing administratively survivable for the vast majority of people who took part in it. The SS and police, along with locally recruited auxiliary units, carried out the roundups, the shootings of those deemed unfit to travel, and the loading of trains. The German civil administration processed the paperwork of confiscation and resettlement. The Wehrmacht, in the overwhelming majority of cases, simply stood aside. Regular army units occupying a town were rarely tasked with the killing itself, and this division allowed a great many soldiers and officers, then and for decades afterwards, to describe themselves as bystanders rather than participants, even when they had watched columns of civilians marched past their billets toward railway sidings. That division of labor was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate policy, worked out at the highest levels of the German state, to keep the machinery of extermination formally separate from the ordinary chain of military command, partly so that officers could not later claim the killing had been forced upon them by orders from above within their own service, and partly because Hitler and Himmler understood that widespread direct participation by the army risked eroding discipline and morale among men who, whatever their politics, had mostly not enlisted expecting to shoot children. The consequence, though, was a moral trapdoor built into the system itself. An officer who did nothing was, by the standards the regime had constructed, blameless. He had not pulled a trigger. He had not signed a deportation order. He had simply held a position while other men in different uniforms did the work. Estimates of how many Wehrmacht officers actively intervened to prevent a deportation anywhere in occupied Europe across the entire war run to a number that can be counted on the fingers of two hands, set against a general officer corps that numbered in the tens of thousands. The overwhelming statistical norm, honestly stated, was compliance, or at minimum, silence. What made refusal so rare was not simply moral failure on the part of individual men, though that was certainly present. It was that the structure of command made refusal both procedurally awkward and personally catastrophic. An officer who obstructed the SS was not merely disagreeing with a colleague. He was interfering with an operation that carried the direct authority of Heinrich Himmler as Reichsführer SS, backed in the general government by a governor, Hans Frank, who answered only to Hitler. To use troops against SS personnel, even briefly, invited investigation not for a breach of etiquette, but for what could plausibly be framed as insubordination bordering on treason in wartime, an offense that carried the possibility of court-martial and execution. Most officers who privately found the deportations distasteful, and there is scattered evidence in letters and post-war testimony that some did, concluded that the personal risk of intervention vastly outweighed any practical good it might do, since the deportation, in almost every recorded case, simply proceeded once resistance was overcome or postponed. The system was built to make each individual act of defiance look futile in isolation, and for the enormous majority of the war, it worked exactly as intended. Albert Battel was, on paper, an unremarkable candidate for the role history assigned him. Born in 1891 in Kleingrauden, in what was then West Prussia, he had served in the First World War, qualified as a lawyer, and by the 1930s was practicing in Breslau, a city where he was reportedly known for representing Jewish clients at a time when doing so carried professional and social cost, though the precise scale and motivation of that earlier legal work is not fully documented and should be treated with appropriate caution. Recalled to military service after the outbreak of war, he was, by mid-1942, serving as an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, attached to the local garrison command in Przemyśl, working under the town's military commander, Colonel Max Liedtke. Neither man was a senior figure in the broader war. Liedtke commanded a garrison responsible for the practical administration of a occupied provincial town, overseeing supply, billeting, and liaison between the army and local civil authorities, precisely the sort of quiet administrative post from which almost nothing of historical note was ever expected to emerge. What Battel and Liedtke had, that most officers elsewhere did not, was a direct institutional stake in the local Jewish population, because a significant number of Jewish men in Przemyśl worked in enterprises that supplied the German garrison directly, including workshops producing equipment and materials the army itself depended upon. This gave Battel a genuine bureaucratic lever that purely moral objection alone would not have provided. He could argue, in the language the regime itself understood, that these particular workers were militarily essential and could not simply be removed without disrupting army supply. It is this combination, documented conviction and available justification, that historians point to when explaining why Battel, rather than any of the tens of thousands of other officers who witnessed similar scenes, chose to act. Whether the military necessity argument was Battel's genuine primary motivation, a convenient legal shield for an underlying moral objection, or some blend of both, is a question the surviving record cannot answer with certainty, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. The events of July 26, 1942, are the best documented episode of Battel's wartime service, largely because they were significant enough to generate a paper trail that survived the war, and because Battel himself, along with Liedtke, was formally investigated by the Nazi Party afterwards, a process that inadvertently preserved much of the detail we now have. As the SS and police prepared to move against the ghetto, Battel arranged for troops under his authority to seal off the bridge over the San River that connected the German administrative quarter to the area where the action was to take place, restricting SS access at the point of entry. Soldiers were positioned with weapons, including at least one machine gun, and access was denied to SS personnel attempting to cross. Separately, and in the days around the same period, Battel is documented as having arranged for roughly 100 Jewish workers and their families, considered essential to garrison supply, to be moved under military protection into a building secured by army guards, placing them, at least temporarily, outside the reach of the deportation being carried out elsewhere in the town that day. The precise final number of people protected by this specific action is recorded inconsistently across surviving sources, with figures cited in different accounts ranging from several dozen to over 100, and readers should treat any single precise figure with some caution. None of this stopped the broader deportation. The SS resumed and completed its operation against the majority of the ghetto population once the immediate standoff at the bridge had passed, and the mass deportations from Przemyśl to Bełżec continued in the following weeks, ultimately destroying the greater part of the town's Jewish community. Battel's intervention did not prevent the catastrophe engulfing Przemyśl's Jews as a whole. What it did was carve out, for a specific and limited group of people, a temporary sanctuary that would not otherwise have existed, purchased at the direct personal risk of the officer who ordered it, and this is a distinction the historical record supports without exaggeration in either direction. If you're finding this story worth your time, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep telling stories like this one. Word of the bridge incident reached senior SS and party authorities within days, and the response illustrates precisely how seriously the system regarded even a single act of obstruction. Reports were filed up the SS chain of command, and the matter eventually reached Himmler himself, who is documented as having ordered that Battel be arrested after the war for his conduct, an instruction whose survival in the record is itself striking evidence of how the regime prioritized even isolated defiance from within its own military. Battel was not arrested during the war, in part because the machinery required to move against a serving Wehrmacht officer for this specific conduct. In the middle of a war, the army was still needed to fight, proved cumbersome, and was ultimately overtaken by events, and, in part, some historians suggest, because his standing as a wounded veteran and Nazi Party member since the 1930s complicated any straightforward case against him as an ideological enemy of the state. He was investigated, his party membership was reportedly suspended, and he continued to serve, though accounts differ on the precise extent to which his career was curtailed as a result. Set against other documented instances of German rescue or obstruction during the Holocaust, Battel's case occupies a distinct position. Wilhelm Hosenfeld, a Wehrmacht captain stationed in occupied Warsaw, is known chiefly for sheltering the pianist Władysław Szpilman and other Polish civilians individually and quietly, an act of concealment rather than confrontation, carried out largely outside the formal chain of command, and without the direct use of troops against SS personnel. Karl Plage, a Wehrmacht officer running a forced labor camp in Vilnius, used his authority over work permits to protect several hundred Jewish laborers by classifying them as essential war workers, a bureaucratic form of protection that shares Battel's use of military necessity as legal cover, but which was sustained quietly over an extended period, rather than through a single dramatic confrontation. Anton Schmid, a sergeant rather than an officer, used his position to smuggle Jewish resistance members out of Vilnius and was court-martialed and executed in 1942 once his activities were discovered, a fate that stands as the clearest illustration of what the system was prepared to do to a German soldier caught in unambiguous, sustained rescue work rather than a single contained incident. Measured against these cases, Battel's action stands out specifically for its use of armed force in open confrontation with the SS, rather than concealment or bureaucratic maneuver, making it, by the assessment of most historians who have examined the period, one of the only recorded instances of a Wehrmacht unit being deployed to physically obstruct an SS deportation action anywhere in occupied Europe. The wartime record contains no comparable American or British episode, for the straightforward reason that Allied forces were not administering occupied territory under a policy of genocide, and so were never placed in the position Battel occupied. The relevant comparison is therefore internal to the German war effort, and it underscores how exceptional Battel's conduct was set against the roughly total absence of similar recorded interventions by his fellow officers across the Eastern territories. The material legacy of what happened at Przemyśl is modest, in keeping with an episode that was, for decades after the war, barely known outside specialist historical circles. There is no monument at the bridge itself marking the confrontation, and for years Battel's story circulated mainly through survivor testimony and the fragmentary SS correspondence that had recorded his defiance as a disciplinary problem rather than as an act worth commemorating. Recognition came slowly. In 1981, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust Remembrance Authority, formally recognized Albert Battel as righteous among the nations, a designation reserved for non-Jews who took significant personal risk to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust, making him one of a very small number of active-duty Wehrmacht officers to receive that honor based on wartime conduct carried out while still serving in uniform. Battel died in 1952, having spent his final years in relative obscurity in West Germany, reportedly struggling for a period to rebuild a legal career amid suspicion from some quarters precisely because of his wartime association with the party he had once joined and later, in this one instance, defied. Colonel Leitke, who bore ultimate command responsibility for authorizing the action and shared in the SS investigation that followed, is comparatively less documented in the post-war record, and much of what is known about the incident's command structure relies on the surviving battle-focused files rather than an equally detailed account from Leitke's own perspective. The wider significance of the episode lies less in its material effect, which was real but limited to a specific and relatively small group of people in one town, than in what it demonstrates about the actual boundaries of the system the Third Reich had built. The regime had constructed an elaborate structure specifically designed to make an ordinary officer's silence look blameless and his intervention look suicidal, and for the overwhelming majority of the war across the whole of occupied Europe, that structure held. Przemyśl matters historically not because it broke that system, since the deportations there continued within days, but because it proved the system had a breaking point at all, that a serving officer, using the army's own authority against the SS's own operation, could force a tactical retreat however temporary, however narrow in its ultimate effect. It is this narrow proof of possibility, rather than any large-scale rescue, that historians have come to regard as the true significance of what Albert Battel did on that bridge. Return, for a moment, to the bank of the San River on the morning of July 26, 1942, to the machine gun positioned facing the approach, and to the SS commander standing on the far side, weighing an order he had not expected to need. On one side of that confrontation stood the entire apparatus of a genocidal state, months into a campaign of extermination that would within 3 years kill roughly 6 million Jewish civilians across occupied Europe, a machine built with extraordinary care to ensure that ordinary soldiers never had to choose, because the choice had already been made for them by men far above their rank. On the other side stood a single first lieutenant, a former defense lawyer from Breslau, who had decided, for reasons the historical record can describe but not fully resolve, that on this particular morning in this particular town, he was not prepared to stand aside. He did not stop the Holocaust in Przemyśl. He did not save the majority of the town's Jewish population, most of whom were murdered at Belzec within weeks of that standoff on the bridge. What he did was smaller and in its way harder to categorize because it does not resolve into a clean story of triumph. He proved, for a matter of hours, that the machine could be made to hesitate, that an SS unit could be turned back by German soldiers acting under German orders, and that the men who built the system of separated responsibility, designed precisely so that no single officer would ever have to make this choice, had not quite succeeded in making the choice impossible. Albert Battel spent the rest of his life largely unrecognized for what he had done, and died 7 years before his story would begin, slowly, to be told. The bridge still stands. The machine gun is long gone. What remains is the fact of the order itself, and the uncomfortable question it leaves behind for every account of this period that follows. Not why so few men did what Battel did, but why, when the moment came, one man decided that doing nothing was no longer a position he could hold.